The first sound Ruth Cooper heard as she crossed into Wilcox land was not a voice at all, but the low, mournful bawl of a calf caught fast in barbed wire. And it was that sound, more than any fear of the men chasing her, that made her rein her horse hard to the left and ride toward trouble instead of away from it. It was the spring of 1879, in the high grass country of Wyoming Territory, where the wind never seemed to rest, and the Laramie Mountains stood blue and jagged against a sky so wide it made a person feel both free and entirely alone. Ruth had been riding since before dawn, her borrowed mare lathered and trembling beneath her own body aching in places she had not known could ache, and she had told herself over and over that she would not stop for anything until she had put 50 miles between herself and Elia's thorn. But the calf's cry cut through her resolve like a blade through cloth, and she found herself dismounting before she had even decided to. The calf was young, spotted red and white, its hind leg torn and bleeding where the wire had bitten deep. Ruth knelt in the wet grass in her travel-stained dress and spoke low and soft to the animal the way her father had taught her long ago, before the debts, before the sickness, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. She worked the wire loose with fingers that shook from exhaustion and cold, and she was still crouched there, blood on her hands, when she heard the horse approaching. She looked up expecting anger, expecting to be run off as a trespasser, and instead found herself looking into the face of a young man who sat his horse as though he had been born to it, his hat pushed back from a face that was sun-browned and serious, his eyes the pale gray-blue of a winter sky. He did not shout. He did not ask her business. He simply swung down from his horse, knelt beside her without a word, and began to help her free the calf's leg, his large hands moving with a gentleness that surprised her. When the calf was loose and had limped off bawling toward the rest of the herd, the young man rose and looked at her, and Ruth waited for him to speak. He did not. He only studied her, taking in her torn hem the dried mud on her boots, the way her hands would not quite stop trembling, and then he reached into his coat and produced a small leather-bound notebook and a stub of pencil, and he wrote something and held it out to her. "You are hurt. Come to the house." "I am not hurt," Ruth said, though her voice cracked on the last word betraying the lie. "Only tired. I did not mean to trespass on your land, sir. I saw the calf and I could not ride past it." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his gray eyes seemed to soften, though his mouth did not smile. He wrote again, "This is Wilcox land. My father owns it. I am Theodore. You are welcome here." "Theodore," Ruth repeated, and something about saying his name aloud when he could not say it himself felt strangely intimate, as though she had been given a gift she had not earned. "I am Ruth Cooper." He nodded once, as if her name settled something in him, and then he gestured toward his horse and toward hers, and then toward a distant cluster of buildings she could just make out against the base of the hills, a ranch house and barn and corrals, smoke rising thin and gray from a stone chimney. He mounted and waited, and Ruth understood that she was meant to follow. She should not have gone. She knew that even then, with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent her whole life being told what she should and should not do. She did not know this silent young man, did not know his father, did not know if the men Elia's thorn had surely sent after her might ride onto this very land within the hour. But she was so very tired, and her mare was spent, and there was something in the quiet, steady way Theodore Wilcox sat his horse that made her feel, for the first time in 3 days, that she might be safe. She mounted and followed him across the grass toward the ranch house, and the wind moved through the tall bluestem like something breathing, and neither of them spoke another word the whole way, though Ruth found she did not mind the silence at all. The Wilcox ranch house was a long, low building of timber and stone, built to withstand wind and winter both, with a wide porch facing west toward the mountains. An older man was standing on that porch when they rode up, a man with silver hair beneath his hat and shoulders still broad and strong despite his years, and he watched their approach with the careful, assessing eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading weather and cattle and trouble before it arrived. "Theodore," the older man called, coming down the porch steps. "Who is this you've brought home?" Theodore dismounted and made a series of quick gestures with his hands, motions that Ruth did not understand but that the older man clearly did, for his brow furrowed with concern and then eased into something like welcome. "He says he found you tending to Cimarron's calf, the one that got tangled in the north fence," the older man said, turning to Ruth. "Says you looked like you'd ridden hard and long and that you needed rest before you needed anything else. I am Samuel Wilcox. This is my ranch and my son Theodore, though it seems you've already made his acquaintance." "Ruth Cooper," she said, dismounting carefully, her legs unsteady beneath her. "I am sorry to intrude, Mr. Wilcox. I did not mean to come onto your land at all. I was only riding, and the calf. You need not explain the calf to me, Miss Cooper. Any woman who stops to free a suffering animal when she herself looks near to falling from her saddle is welcome at my table." Samuel's eyes moved over her travel-worn clothes, the fear still lingering in her face, and something in his expression told Ruth that he understood, even without being told, that she was running from something. "Come inside. We will feed you, and you will tell us as much or as little as you like, and then you will sleep, because you look as though you have not slept properly in some days." Ruth wanted to refuse, to insist she must be on her way, but her body betrayed her the moment she stepped onto the porch, her knees buckling, and it was Theodore's arm that caught her, steady and sure, before she could fall. She did not remember much of the rest of that first evening. She remembered the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of beans and cornbread, the taste of strong coffee. She remembered Samuel Wilcox asking gentle questions she did not fully answer, and Theodore watching her from across the table with those quiet gray eyes, never speaking, but never looking away either. She remembered being shown to a small room off the back of the house, a narrow bed with a quilt sewn in a pattern of stars, and she remembered thinking, just before sleep took her entirely, that she had not felt this safe in longer than she could remember. She slept for nearly 14 hours. When Ruth woke, the light through the small window was already high and golden, and for a moment she did not know where she was, and panic rose hot in her chest before memory returned. She rose, smoothed her dress as best she could, and went out into the main room of the house, where she found Samuel Wilcox at the table mending a bridle, and no sign of Theodore at all. "He is out with the herd," Samuel said, without her having to ask. "He rises before the sun most days. There is coffee on the stove and bread if you are hungry." Ruth ate gratefully, and as she did, Samuel Wilcox set aside his mending and studied her with the same careful eyes his son had. "You will forgive an old man's bluntness, Miss Cooper, but you rode onto my land looking like the devil himself was on your trail, and I find myself wondering if that is nearer the truth than I would like." Ruth's hands tightened around her coffee cup. She had known this conversation would come, had turned it over in her mind while she rode, deciding how much to tell and how much to keep locked away. But there was something about Samuel Wilcox's plain, unhurried manner that made lying feel both impossible and unnecessary. "There is a man," she said slowly. "Elias Thorne. He owns half the town of Larkspur Creek, the bank, the mercantile, more cattle than I could count. My father owed him money before he died, a great deal of money, and Thorne came to me after the funeral and told me the debt could be settled in one of two ways. I could pay it, which I could not, having nothing left but the house, which he had already claimed a lien against, or I could marry him." "And you did not wish to marry him," Samuel said, not as a question. "He is nearly 50 years old, Mr. Wilcox, and cruel in ways that are easy to see and ways that are not. I would rather starve on the prairie than spend my life in his house." Ruth's voice trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "I ran 3 nights ago, after he told me the wedding would be within the fortnight, whether I consented or not. I took a horse from the livery, one I have since realized was not entirely mine to take, and I have been riding since, trying to reach my aunt in Cheyenne. I did not intend to stop here. I did not intend to stop anywhere." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Ruth feared she had said too much, had frightened this kind old man with the weight of her troubles. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Elias Thorne is known to me, Miss Cooper, and not favorably. A man who would force a young woman into marriage to settle a debt is no man at all, in my estimation, whatever his fortune. You will stay here as long as you need to. This is a large ranch, and there is always work for capable hands, and God knows my son could use the company of someone nearer his own age than his old father. I could not impose. You are not imposing. You are earning your keep, same as anyone who works this land. Can you cook, sew, ride?" "All three," Ruth said, and for the first time in days something like a smile touched her lips, "though perhaps not so well as I would like to think." "Good enough," Samuel said, and returned to his mending, the matter apparently settled. That first week passed in a haze of exhausted gratitude and careful adjustment. Ruth found herself falling into the rhythms of ranch life with a readiness that surprised her, rising before dawn to help with the milking, learning the particular chaos of the henhouse, mending shirts and darning socks in the evenings by lamplight. Samuel Wilcox proved to be a man of dry humor and deep kindness beneath his weathered exterior, and Ruth found herself growing fond of him quickly, in the way one grows fond of a father one has lost too soon. But it was Theodore who occupied her thoughts most, in ways she did not entirely understand. He was not, she came to realize, born without the ability to speak. Samuel explained it to her one evening quietly, while Theodore was out checking the fences, as though he did not want his son to overhear even a conversation about himself. "Theodore spoke same as any child until he was 9 years old," Samuel said, his voice roughened with old grief. "His mother, my wife Eleanor, God rest her, died in a fire that took half our barn and near took the house besides. Theodore was there. He tried to pull her free and he could not, and the last thing he ever said with his own voice was her name, screamed over and over into that smoke. After that, nothing. Not one word in 18 years. The doctors in Cheyenne called it shock, said his voice might return any day or might never return at all. We stopped hoping for it long ago. He speaks with his hands now, a language we built together, he and I, out of necessity and love. And he writes when he needs to speak with someone who does not know our signs. He has made his peace with it, or I believed he had, until you rode onto this land." "Why do you say that?" Ruth asked, her heart aching for the boy Theodore had been, the boy who had screamed his mother's name into a burning night and never spoken again. "Because I have not seen him laugh, truly laugh, not with his eyes the way he does now, since before that fire. And I have watched him watch you, Miss Cooper, these past days, and I have seen something in him I thought had died with his mother." Ruth did not know what to say to that, and she was grateful when Samuel did not press her further, only returned to his pipe and let the matter rest between them like a seed planted but not yet grown. She began, in the days that followed, to learn Theodore's signs, slowly and imperfectly at first. He was patient with her mistakes in a way that touched her deeply, never impatient, never frustrated, only pleased, it seemed, that she wished to learn at all. He taught her the sign for horse, for cattle, for sky, for rain. He taught her his sign for his own name, a simple motion of the hand across the heart that Samuel told her Eleanor had invented for him when he was still a small boy who loved to talk more than any child Samuel had ever known. And Ruth, in turn, found herself talking to Theodore in ways she had never talked to anyone, filling the comfortable silences between them with stories of her childhood, her father's small horse ranch outside Larkspur Creek, her mother who had died when Ruth was 12, her fears and her hopes, and the particular loneliness of being a young woman alone in a world that seemed determined to hand her over to whichever man claimed the largest debt against her. Theodore listened to all of it with an attention so complete it made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly heard. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks after her arrival, Ruth found him sitting alone on the porch steps as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. She sat beside him without asking, as had become their habit, and for a long while they simply watched the light change together. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. "Speaking, I mean. Do you miss the sound of your own voice?" Theodore was quiet for a long moment, and then he took out his notebook, which he now carried always, and wrote slowly, as though choosing each word with care. "I do not remember what my voice sounds like. I was a boy. It has been a long time." "That must be terribly lonely," Ruth said. He looked at her then, his gray eyes steady in the fading light, and wrote again, "I was lonely, before you came." Ruth felt something shift in her chest, warm and frightening at once, and she did not trust herself to speak, so instead she reached over and took his hand, the one still holding the pencil, and held it gently in both of hers. Theodore did not pull away. He turned his hand within hers until their fingers laced together, and they sat like that as the last light faded from the sky, saying nothing at all, and needing to say nothing at all. Spring gave way to early summer, and the Wilcox ranch settled into the long, hard rhythm of the season, branding calves, mending fences torn loose by winter storms, watching the sky each evening for signs of the thunderheads that could bring either life-saving rain or devastating hail. Ruth threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even her, and she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she had never in her life felt so useful, so necessary, so entirely herself. She rode out with Theodore often now, checking the herds, and she learned more of his sign language with each passing week, until they could hold whole conversations without a single spoken word passing between them. Conversations about the weather, about the cattle, about the small joys and irritations of daily life. And increasingly, conversations about things that mattered far more. It was on one such ride, in the heat of a June afternoon, that Ruth first told Theodore the fuller truth of what she had left behind. They had stopped near a small creek to water the horses, and Ruth sat on a flat rock in the shade of a cottonwood tree, watching the water move over smooth stones, and she found the words coming before she had quite decided to speak them. "He was not always cruel," my father used to say. "Elias Thorne, I mean. He said Thorne had been a decent man once before his first wife died and left him bitter and grasping. But I never knew that man. I only knew the one who looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he intends to buy, sizing up my worth, deciding whether I would suit his purposes." Theodore's jaw tightened, and his hands moved swiftly. "He should not have spoken to you that way. He should not have looked at you that way." "No," Ruth agreed. "He should not have. But my father's debts were real, Theodore, and when my father died, those debts became mine to answer for, whether I wished them to be or not. That is how it is for women in my position. We do not choose our own futures. They are chosen for us by men who hold the paper on our father's failures." Theodore was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster, and then he wrote something and held it out, and Ruth read it twice before she trusted herself to look up at him. "You are not a debt to be paid. You are not property. You are Ruth Cooper, and you are the bravest person I have ever known, and any man who could not see that does not deserve to be spoken of in the same breath as you." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, unexpected and unstoppable, and she did not try to hide them from him. "You are the first person who has said such a thing to me in longer than I can remember," she said, her voice breaking. "The first person who has looked at me and seen anything more than what I might be worth to someone else." Theodore reached over and, with a gentleness that undid her completely, brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He did not write anything more. He did not need to. The look in his eyes said everything that his voice could not, and Ruth understood, sitting there beside that creek with the cottonwood leaves whispering above them, that she had fallen in love with Theodore Wilcox, silent son of a Wyoming rancher, more completely and more surely than she had ever imagined it was possible to love another human being. That summer deepened around them like a held breath. Samuel Wilcox, watching his son and the young woman who had ridden onto his land, said nothing directly, but Ruth caught him smiling to himself more than once over his evening pipe, and she suspected he understood exactly what was blossoming between them, and approved of it entirely. There were quiet moments that summer that Ruth would carry with her for the rest of her life. The evening Theodore taught her to whistle for the dogs the way he did, using no words at all, only breath and pitch, and she finally managed it after a dozen failed attempts, and he laughed, silently but visibly, his whole face transformed by an unguarded joy she had never seen in him before. The afternoon, a sudden summer storm caught them both far from the house, and they sheltered together beneath a rocky overhang, soaked through and shivering, and Theodore had wrapped his coat around her shoulders and held her close until the worst of the storm passed, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The night of the 4th of July, when the small town of Larkspur Creek held its yearly celebration, and Samuel insisted they all attend, and Ruth had danced with Theodore beneath strings of lantern light while a local fiddler played, and though he could not speak the words of the songs, he had held her as though she were the only steady thing in an unsteady world, and she had felt in that moment entirely and completely happy. But happiness, Ruth had learned early in her life, was rarely allowed to last uninterrupted, and it was at that very celebration that trouble found her again. She saw him across the crowded street before she consciously recognized what she was seeing. A tall figure in a dark coat far too fine for a small ranching town, silver-headed cane in hand, and her blood turned to ice in her veins even before her mind fully supplied the name. Elias Thorne had found her. "Ruth Cooper," he said, his voice carrying easily over the noise of the celebration as he approached, and several nearby townsfolk turned to look, sensing trouble the way people in small towns always seem to. "I confess I had nearly given up hope of finding you, though I suppose I ought to have thought of Larkspur Creek's nearest neighbors sooner. The Wilcox Ranch. How charmingly rustic." "Mr. Thorne," Ruth's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her hands had begun to tremble at her sides, "I have nothing to say to you. You have a debt to answer for, my dear, and a promise you made before God and the county clerk's office, whatever your feelings on the matter might be." Thorne's eyes moved past her to where Theodore had come to stand beside her, silent and tense, his body angled protectively toward Ruth. "And who is this?" "Ah, yes. The Wilcox boy. I had heard he was simple." "Mute, is it? How very convenient for you, my dear, to hide yourself away with a man who cannot even ask you the questions I imagine you would rather not answer." Something dangerous flashed in Theodore's eyes at that, and his hands rose swiftly, and though Thorne could not read the signs, Ruth could, and she pressed a steadying hand against Theodore's arm to keep him from advancing. "He is not simple," Theodore had signed, sharp and fast. "He is a coward who hides his cruelty behind money, and you will not speak to her that way again." Ruth relayed none of this to Thorne, but she stepped forward instead, putting herself between the two men, her chin raised. "I made no promise, Mr. Thorne. You made a demand and I refused it, and I will go on refusing it for as long as I draw breath. My father's debts died with him, whatever your lawyers may claim otherwise, and I will not be handed over like a piece of property to settle accounts I never agreed to." A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the tension crackling in the summer air, and Ruth was aware of Samuel Wilcox pushing through the onlookers to stand at her other side, his weathered face hard with an anger she had not seen in him before. "Thorne," Samuel said, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man well respected in the territory, "this is not the place, and Miss Cooper is not obligated to you in any way that any honest court would recognize. I suggest you return to Larkspur Creek before I find cause to discuss your business practices with the territorial marshal, who I understand has been asking questions of late about certain liens filed against dead men's estates." Thorne's face darkened, but he was, whatever else his faults, a careful man, unwilling to make more of a scene than necessary in front of half the county. He straightened his coat and offered a thin, cold smile. "This is not finished, Miss Cooper. I have paper on your father's property that no territorial marshal can simply wave away, and I am a patient man. I will see you again before the summer is through." He turned his cold gaze on Theodore one last time. Enjoy your silent guardian while you can, my dear. Silence has never yet won a legal argument. He walked away into the crowd, and Ruth felt herself trembling now that the confrontation had passed, the fear she had held at bay finally breaking through. Theodore turned to her immediately, his hands moving with urgent tenderness. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" "No," Ruth managed. "No, I am only frightened. He will not simply let this go, Theodore. He has money enough to make the law dance to whatever tune he plays." "Not on my land, he does not," Samuel said grimly. "Come, let us go home. We will speak of this properly there, where cooler heads and clearer thoughts might serve us better than a crowded street." That night, at the Wilcox kitchen table, the three of them sat late into the evening working through what might be done. Samuel explained, with the patient thoroughness of a man who had spent decades navigating territorial law and the particular ways money could bend it, that Thorne's claim against Ruth's father's estate might indeed have some legal standing, however unjustly acquired, but that no court in the territory could force a grown woman into marriage, whatever debts remained unpaid. "The danger," Samuel said grimly, "is not the law, not directly. The danger is a man like Thorne deciding the law is too slow and taking matters into his own hands. He has money enough to hire men who are not particular about how they earn their pay." Ruth's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I would not have you and Theodore put at risk on my account, Samuel. Perhaps it would be better if I went on to my aunt's in Cheyenne as I had originally intended, before Thorne can bring more trouble to your door." Theodore's response was immediate and forceful, his hands cutting through the air with an intensity that needed no interpretation even before Ruth read the words on his face. "No, you will not leave. This is your home now if you wish it to be. I will not let him take you from this place, from us, whatever it costs." "Theodore, I mean it, Ruth." He had never signed her name before with such deliberate emphasis, and something in the gesture, the way his fingers formed the letters he had taught her only weeks before, made her breath catch. "I have watched you find your courage every single day since you rode onto this land. I will not watch you run from a man who has none." Samuel, watching this exchange, nodded slowly. "My son is right, Miss Cooper. However, he might phrase it more plainly than an old man's pride allows me to say myself. You are welcome here for as long as you wish to stay, and we will face whatever Elias Thorne brings to our door together, as a family faces such things. I only ask that we do so with wisdom as well as courage. I will write to the territorial marshal's office in the morning, and to my old friend Judge Pemberton in Cheyenne, and we will see what protection the law can actually offer, whatever Thorne might claim to the contrary." Ruth looked between the two men, father and son, who had taken her in as a stranger and now stood ready to defend her as family, and something in her chest ached with a gratitude too large for words. "Thank you," she whispered, "both of you. I do not know how I will ever repay such kindness." "You need not repay it," Samuel said gently. "Kindness given freely does not require repayment, but if you wish to give something in return, Miss Cooper, you might simply continue being exactly who you are. That has been repayment enough for this old man, watching my son come alive again after so many years of quiet grief." The weeks that followed carried a new tension beneath the ranch's familiar rhythms, a watchfulness that had not existed before. Samuel wrote his letters and received cautious replies, Judge Pemberton confirming that no lien against a deceased man's estate could compel his daughter into marriage, whatever moral pressure Thorne might attempt to apply, but warning that Thorne was known to operate as much through intimidation as through law, and that caution remained wise. Theodore took to keeping his rifle nearer at hand than had previously been his habit, and he made a point of riding the fence lines nearest the road more often, watching for strangers. Ruth found herself grateful for his vigilance even as it frightened her, a constant reminder that her past had not released its grip on her simply because she wished it would. But even beneath that tension, love continued to grow between them, patient and deepening, like a river carving its course through stone. Ruth learned more of Theodore's language, and he, in turn, seemed to find new ways each week to communicate what words alone could never have carried, small gestures of devotion that spoke louder than any voice. He built her a small writing desk from scrap lumber so she would have somewhere to keep the letters she wrote to her aunt in Cheyenne, a place to sit and think and dream. He learned, through careful observation, exactly how she liked her coffee, and made certain there was always a cup waiting when she rose in the mornings. He taught her to ride astride rather than side saddle, laughing his silent laugh when she nearly toppled from the horse the first several attempts, but never once making her feel foolish for trying. And one warm evening in late July, as the two of them sat together on a low hill overlooking the ranch, watching the cattle graze in the golden evening light, Theodore took her hand and, instead of reaching for his notebook, simply looked at her, his gray eyes so full of feeling that Ruth felt her breath catch in her throat. He raised his free hand and made a series of signs she had not learned before, slow and deliberate, watching her face carefully to see if she understood. She did not entirely, and she shook her head gently. "I do not know that one, Theodore. Show me again slowly." He repeated the signs, and this time he added with his other hand the sign she did know, the one that meant heart, pressed against his chest and then extended toward her, and understanding broke over her like sunrise. "You love me," Ruth whispered, tears rising unbidden in her eyes. "You are telling me that you love me." Theodore nodded, his own eyes bright, and he reached for his notebook then, as though the moment demanded more certainty than signs alone could offer, and he wrote with a hand that trembled slightly. "I love you, Ruth Cooper. I have loved you since the day I watched you kneel in the mud to free a calf that was not yours to save, because your heart would not let you ride past suffering without trying to ease it. I do not know how to say this with my voice, but I would give anything, everything, to be able to say it to you the way you deserve to hear it." "You have said it," Ruth said, taking the notebook from his hands and setting it aside, cupping his face between her palms instead. "You have said it more beautifully than any voice ever could, Theodore Wilcox. I love you too. I think I have loved you since that very first evening, when you sat beside me on the porch and let me talk until I had no more words left, and never once made me feel that my troubles were too much for you to bear." He kissed her then, gently at first, and then with a depth of feeling that left them both breathless, and above them the sky turned from gold to rose to deep indigo, the first stars emerging one by one, and neither of them noticed the passing of time at all. So complete was the world contained within that single, perfect moment. But even as love bloomed fully between them, the shadow of Elia's thorn had not lifted, and it was barely a week later that the shadow finally fell. Ruth had ridden alone that morning to the small creek where she and Theodore had first spoken of her past, wanting a quiet hour to think and to write in the journal Samuel had gifted her, and she did not hear the riders approach until they were nearly upon her. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men she did not recognize, and at their head, unmistakable even at a distance, rode Elia's Thorn himself. "Miss Cooper," Thorn called, drawing his horse to a halt a short distance away, his men fanning out on either side in a manner that made Ruth's stomach clench with fear. "How fortunate to find you alone. I had hoped we might have a private conversation, away from the protective ears of your rustic hosts." Ruth's hand went instinctively to the small knife she had taken to carrying since the 4th of July, tucked into her boot, though she knew it would offer little protection against 3 armed men. "I have nothing to discuss with you, Mr. Thorn. I told you as much when last we spoke." "You told me a great many things, Miss Cooper, none of which change the fact that your father's estate owes me $11,000, a debt which, absent your marriage to settle it, I will be forced to collect through less pleasant means. I understand the Wilcox ranch has become quite dear to you. It would be a shame if certain accidents were to befall it. Fences cut, cattle scattered, perhaps a fire, God forbid, in this dry summer weather." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable and cold, and Ruth felt fear give way to a fury she had not known she possessed. "You would burn an innocent family's ranch to punish me for refusing to marry you. What manner of man are you, Elias Thorne? A practical one, my dear. I find that most people, when faced with the true cost of their principles, discover those principles were rather more flexible than they had believed. Thorne's smile was thin and without warmth. You have until the end of the month to reconsider my offer. Marry me, and your father's debt is settled, and no harm need come to anyone. Refuse, and I promise you, Miss Cooper, that the Wilcox family will come to deeply regret ever having offered you shelter. He turned his horse then, his men following, and rode off across the grass, leaving Ruth trembling with a mixture of terror and rage so complete she could scarcely draw breath. She rode back to the ranch as fast as her horse would carry her and found Theodore in the barn, and the moment he saw her face, he knew something was terribly wrong. She told him everything, her hands shaking as she formed the signs she had learned, supplementing with spoken words when the signs failed her, and Theodore's face grew darker and darker with each detail, his jaw tight with a fury she had never seen in him before. He threatened to burn our land. He threatened to hurt my father, his herds, everything we have built. Theodore's hands moved fast and hard. I will not allow this. I will ride to Larkspur Creek myself and make him understand. No, Ruth said firmly, catching his hands in hers to still them. No, Theodore, that is exactly what he wants, to provoke you into some rash action that gives him cause to bring the law down upon you instead of himself. He is a coward who hides behind money and hired men. We must be smarter than he is, not angrier. Samuel, when told of the threat that evening, was grim but characteristically measured. We will need more than Judge Pemberton's letters to stop a man like Thorne, if he is truly willing to burn a man's livelihood to get what he wants. I have an old friend, Marshal Kobe Hale, stationed out of Cheyenne, a fair man and not one to be bought easily. I will ride out tomorrow and bring him back with me if he will come. In the meantime, we watch the herds closely, and we do not let Ruth ride alone again until this matter is settled, one way or another. The days that followed were tense with waiting, the ranch's usual rhythms overlaid with a watchfulness that kept everyone on edge. Theodore barely left Ruth's side, riding with her whenever she needed to leave the house, sleeping some nights in the barn nearest the house rather than his usual quarters, his rifle always within reach. Ruth found his protectiveness both comforting and heartbreaking, knowing the toll it took on him to carry such fear for her safety on top of his own old wounds. It was on the fourth night after Thorne's threat, with Samuel still 3 days from returning with the marshal, that the danger finally arrived in full. Ruth woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of frantic lowing from the direction of the barn, and her heart lurched with terror even before she was fully awake. She rushed to the window and saw, with horror, flames already licking up one corner of the hay barn, orange light flickering against the darkness, and figures moving in the shadows near the corral, men working quickly to cut the fence and scatter the horses. She ran from her room screaming Theodore's name before she remembered he could not hear it, but he was already awake, already moving, having seen the fire from his own window, and he met her in the hallway, his face grim with a fury she had never seen in him. Stay in the house, *, he signed frantically. Bar the door. Do not come outside. Theodore, no, there are men out there, you cannot face them alone. But he was already gone, snatching his rifle from beside the door and running out into the smoke-hazed night, and Ruth, her heart pounding with terror for him, could not bring herself to obey his instruction to stay hidden. She grabbed the shotgun Samuel kept beside the kitchen door and followed him out into the chaos. The scene that met her was one of pure confusion, flames rising higher now against the night sky, horses screaming and bolting through the cut fence, and 3 shadowy figures she recognized with sick certainty as Thorne's hired men, one of them holding a torch still, clearly intent on setting further fires. Theodore had already engaged the nearest man, wrestling for control of a pistol, the 2 of them grappling in the flickering light, and Ruth's blood ran cold with fear for him. "Theodore!" she screamed, and this time it did not matter that he could not hear her, because the word tore from her own throat as pure instinct, pure terror, and somewhere in the chaos of that burning night, something extraordinary happened. Theodore, hearing nothing but seeing everything, saw the second man raising his pistol toward Ruth, drawn by the sound of her scream, and in that moment of pure animal terror for the woman he loved, something broke free in him that had been locked away for 18 long years. "Ruth, get down!" The words tore from his throat raw and unpracticed, cracked and desperate, but unmistakably, undeniably a voice, his voice, the first words Theodore Wilcox had spoken aloud since he was 9 years old, screaming his mother's name into a burning night not so different from this one. Ruth dropped instinctively at the sound of his warning, and the shot meant for her went wide. And in the chaos of that moment, Theodore's fury found new strength, fueled by a voice he had thought lost forever, and he wrestled the pistol from the man he grappled with and struck him hard enough to send him sprawling into the dirt. The man who had fired at Ruth, startled by the sound of a voice he had been told did not exist, hesitated for one crucial second, and that hesitation was enough for Ruth to level the shotgun she carried and fire a warning blast into the air above his head, close enough to make his horse rear and nearly throw him. "Get off this land," Ruth shouted, her hands shaking but her aim steady as she leveled the shotgun again, this time at the man directly. "Get off this land now, or the next shot will not miss." The third man, seeing his companions overwhelmed and the fire beginning to draw attention from the bunkhouse where ranch hands were now stumbling out in alarm, made the decision for all of them, wheeling his horse and fleeing into the darkness, the others scrambling to follow, one of them still clutching his jaw where Theodore's fist had connected. The fire, though frightening, had caught only the corner of the hay barn, and with the ranch hands now roused and organized, buckets of water and wet blankets soon had it smothered before it could spread further. But Ruth barely noticed any of that, because she was running toward Theodore, who stood in the settling smoke with an expression of such stunned wonder on his face that she nearly wept just looking at him. "Theodore," she said, reaching him, her hands going to his face, checking for injury even as tears streamed down her own cheeks. "Theodore, you spoke. I heard you, you spoke." He opened his mouth, and for a moment nothing came, as though his voice, having broken free once in desperate crisis, was uncertain whether it was truly welcome to return. But then, slowly, haltingly, the words came again, rough and unpracticed but entirely his own. "I could not lose you," he said, his voice cracking on every syllable, tears now standing in his own eyes. "I heard the shot and I thought I could not lose you, Ruth. I would rather die than lose you." "You are not going to lose me," Ruth said, laughing and crying at once as she pulled him close. "You saved my life just now with your voice and your own 2 hands, and I am not going anywhere, Theodore Wilcox, not ever, not while I have breath left in my body." They stood together in the smoke and settling chaos, holding each other as though they might never let go, and around them the ranch hands worked to finish extinguishing the fire and gather the scattered horses, and somewhere in the darkness, Elias Thorne's hired men rode away in defeat, though Ruth knew with grim certainty that this would not be the last they heard from Thorne himself. Samuel Wilcox returned 2 days later, not with Marshal Kobe Hale beside him, but with the marshal riding just behind, having been convinced by Samuel's letter and his own long friendship that the situation warranted investigation. When Samuel heard what had happened in his absence, when he saw the burned corner of his barn and heard, with his own ears, his son's voice for the first time in 18 years, he wept openly, unashamed, holding Theodore against him as though he could not quite believe the miracle standing before him. "My boy," he said over and over. "My boy has his voice back. Eleanor, if you can see this, your boy has found his voice again." Marshal Hale, a lean, serious man with a badge that had clearly seen hard use, took careful statements from everyone involved, and though Thorne's hired men could not be immediately located, the marshal's investigation soon uncovered a pattern of similar intimidation Thorne had used against other debtors across the territory. Enough evidence, combined with witness testimony of attempted arson, to secure a warrant for Elias Thorne's arrest. It took another 2 weeks for the marshal to track Thorne down, weeks during which Theodore's voice grew steadily stronger, if still unpracticed, each day bringing new words, new sentences, a young man rediscovering a part of himself he had believed lost forever. Ruth cherished every halting sentence, every rough-edged word, finding them more beautiful than the finest poetry, because each one was a testament to the courage that lived within him, courage that had finally found a way to break free. When word finally came that Thorne had been arrested in Cheyenne, attempting to flee the territory with what remained of his ill-gotten fortune, Ruth felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Judge Pemberton, reviewing the full extent of Thorne's fraudulent claims against her father's estate, formally voided the debt entirely, ruling that the lien had been improperly filed and that Ruth Cooper owed Elias Thorne nothing at all, not money, not marriage, not one single thing. "You are free," Samuel told her, when the judge's ruling arrived by letter. "Truly and completely free, Ruth. No debt, no obligation, no shadow hanging over you any longer." Ruth read the letter twice, sitting at the small writing desk Theodore had built for her, and felt tears rising, not of fear this time, but of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She found Theodore in the barn, still cautious with his voice but growing more confident with each passing day, and she told him the news, and watched his face light up with a joy that matched her own. "Free," he repeated, testing the word, his voice still rough but growing stronger. "You are free, Ruth." "We are free," she corrected gently. "Free of Thorne, free of my father's debts, free to build whatever life we choose now, without fear hanging over us." She took his hands in hers, looking up into his gray eyes, which held none of the guarded caution she had seen there when they first met, only open, unguarded love. "And I find, Theodore Wilcox, that the life I choose is one spent beside you here on this land, for as long as we both shall live, if you would have me." Theodore's breath caught, and for a moment he seemed unable to find words at all, his hands rising instead in the sign language that had first brought them together, the sign for love, the sign for heart, before he finally found his voice again, rougher now with emotion. "I would have you forever, Ruth Cooper. I would have you as my wife, if you would do me the honor of accepting such an imperfect man, a man who spent 18 years unable to tell you how he felt, and who will likely stumble over these words for years to come." "There is nothing imperfect about you, Theodore," Ruth said fiercely, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "You are the bravest, gentlest, most extraordinary man I have ever known, and I would be honored, more honored than I can possibly express, to become your wife." He kissed her then, and the kiss tasted of tears and relief, and a joy so complete it seemed to fill every corner of Ruth's soul, and somewhere nearby, though neither of them noticed at first, Samuel Wilcox stood watching from the barn door, his own eyes bright with tears, having witnessed the moment he had begun to hope for the very night Ruth Cooper first rode onto his land. They were married in October, when the aspens in the high country had turned to gold, and the air carried the first crisp bite of coming autumn. The ceremony took place on the ranch itself, beneath the same cottonwood tree where Theodore had first told Ruth he loved her, with Reverend Alden traveling out from Larkspur Creek to perform the service, and half the county in attendance, for Samuel Wilcox was well liked and well respected, and word of his son's miraculous recovery of speech, combined with the story of the young woman who had inspired it, had spread through the territory like wildfire. Drawing curious well-wishers from towns Ruth had never even visited. Ruth wore a simple dress of pale blue, sewn by her own hands with help from several of the ranch wives who had befriended her over the summer months, and when she walked toward Theodore beneath the golden cottonwood leaves, her heart felt so full she thought it might burst from the sheer weight of her happiness. Theodore, standing beside Reverend Alden with Samuel at his other side, watched her approach with an expression of such open, undisguised love that several of the older women in attendance were seen wiping their eyes with handkerchiefs before the ceremony had even properly begun. "Do you, Theodore Wilcox," Reverend Alden intoned, "take this woman, Ruth Cooper, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Theodore said, his voice steady now, strong and sure, 18 years of silence having given way entirely to a voice that spoke his vows with unwavering conviction. "I do, with my whole heart and with everything I am." "And do you, Ruth Cooper, take this man, Theodore Wilcox, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion but no less certain. "I have never wanted anything more in my entire life." When Reverend Alden pronounced them husband and wife, and Theodore leaned in to kiss his bride beneath the golden leaves, the gathered crowd erupted into cheers and applause, and somewhere among them, Samuel Wilcox wept openly, unashamed, thinking of his beloved Eleanor and wishing, with his whole grieving heart, that she could have lived to see this day, to see their son so completely, joyfully alive. The years that followed brought their own share of hardship, as all lives on the frontier inevitably did, harsh winters that tested the herds and the family's resilience alike, dry summers that made every drop of rain feel like a miracle, the ordinary struggles of building a life and a home in a land that offered no guarantees and demanded constant labor in exchange for whatever bounty it provided. But they faced each hardship together, Ruth and Theodore, their partnership growing stronger with each passing season, their love deepening in ways that neither of them could have imagined possible on that first quiet evening, when Theodore had written his first careful words to a frightened, exhausted stranger kneeling in the grass beside an injured calf. Theodore's voice, once returned, never left him again, though it retained always a certain roughness, a particular quality that Ruth came to love above all other sounds in the world, the sound of a man who had spent 18 years in silence and had finally found something worth breaking that silence for. He still used his hands sometimes, out of old habit, particularly when words felt insufficient for the depth of what he wished to express, and Ruth learned to read both languages fluently, the spoken and the signed, until the two of them communicated in a manner entirely their own, woven from both silence and voice, from patience and passion, from all the years of careful understanding they had built between them. Samuel Wilcox lived to see 3 grandchildren born on that ranch, living long enough to hold each one in his weathered arms and whisper stories of their grandmother Eleanor, and of the courageous young woman who had ridden onto their land one spring morning and changed all their lives forever. Their first child was a son, born in the summer of 1880, whom they named Samuel after his grandfather, a boisterous, loud child who seemed determined from his very first breath to make up for all the years of silence that had once filled that ranch house, much to his grandfather's endless delight. Their second child, born 2 years later, was a daughter they named Eleanor, after the grandmother she would never meet but whose memory lived on in every corner of that beloved ranch, in the quilt with stars that still covered Ruth and Theodore's bed, in the particular tenderness Theodore showed his small daughter that echoed, Samuel often said with tears in his eyes, the very same tenderness Eleanor had once shown her own son. A third child followed in 1885, another son, whom they named Elias, not after the man who had once threatened to destroy everything they held dear, but after Ruth's own late father, whose name had also been Elias, reclaiming that name from the shadow it had once carried and giving it new, gentler meaning within their family. Elias Thorne himself served 11 years in the territorial prison for fraud and attempted arson, his fortune seized to repay the many debtors he had wronged over the years, and Ruth heard occasionally, through the passing years, that he had emerged from prison a broken, diminished man, stripped of the power and cruelty that had once made him so fearsome. She felt when she heard such news, not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet sense of justice served, a recognition that the world, however slowly, however imperfectly, did sometimes right its wrongs, and that the injustices she had suffered as a young woman with no legal standing to refuse an unwanted marriage had at least, in her own case, been answered and overcome. The Wilcox Ranch prospered in the years that followed, growing from a modest operation into one of the most respected cattle ranches in that part of Wyoming Territory, and later, after 1890, in the newly formed state itself. Theodore proved himself not only a capable rancher, but an innovative one, introducing new breeding practices he had read about in agricultural journals Ruth brought back from her occasional visits to Cheyenne, and the ranch's reputation for quality cattle spread throughout the region. But for all their material success, it was the quality of their partnership that Ruth cherished most in the years that followed her wedding day. Theodore never stopped finding new ways to express his love for her, whether through the small writing desk he had built when words still failed him, or the wildflowers he brought her each spring without fail, or the countless evenings they spent together on that same porch, where she had first heard his silence transformed into welcome, watching the sun set behind the mountains while their children played in the yard below. On the 10th anniversary of the night Theodore first found his voice, they sat together on that same porch, their 3 children long since put to bed, the stars emerging one by one in the wide Wyoming sky, and Theodore took Ruth's hand in his, weathered now with a decade of ranch work but still gentle, still careful, still entirely devoted to her. "Do you remember?" he said, his voice still carrying that particular rough quality that Ruth had come to love more than any smooth, practiced voice could ever have been. "The very first thing I ever said to you." "Get down," Ruth said, smiling at the memory even now, though it still carried an edge of the terror she had felt that night. "You screamed at me to get down. I have thought many times since that it was a rather unromantic way to first speak to the woman I loved," Theodore said, and Ruth laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I have never once thought it unromantic," she said softly. "I have thought it the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, because it meant you loved me enough to break 18 years of silence just to keep me safe. There is nothing more romantic than that, Theodore Wilcox, not in any story I have ever heard or read." He kissed the top of her head, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the kind of silence that no longer carried any loneliness within it, only the deep contentment of 2 people who had found in each other everything they had ever needed. "I used to believe," Theodore said eventually, his voice quiet and thoughtful, "that my silence was a kind of prison, that I was trapped behind a wall I could never climb over, no matter how hard I tried. But I have come to think in the years since that perhaps that silence taught me something I might never have learned otherwise. It taught me to listen, truly listen, in a way that speaking men rarely bother to do. It taught me to see the things that words sometimes hide, the truth beneath what people say and do not say. And it was that listening, I think, that first told me you were worth loving, long before I ever found the courage or the voice to tell you so myself." "And I have come to think," Ruth said, turning her face up to look at him, her eyes shining with the same love she had felt from nearly the very first day, "that perhaps I was always meant to ride onto this land on that particular morning and find that calf caught in the wire and find you. I do not believe in coincidence, Theodore. I believe some things are simply meant to be, however winding and difficult the path that leads us there." "Then I am glad," Theodore said, "more glad than I have words to properly express, even now, even with a voice fully returned to me, that the path led you here, led you to me." "As am I," Ruth whispered, and she kissed him then, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, surrounded by the land they had built their life upon together, the land where a silent son had found his voice, and a frightened young woman had found her courage, and where together they had found a love so complete and so enduring that neither silence nor cruelty nor any hardship the frontier could offer had ever been able to break it. They lived out their years on that ranch, watching their children grow, welcoming grandchildren in the fullness of time. Samuel Wilcox living to a contented old age, surrounded by the family he had never dared hope for in the darkest years after Eleanor's death. The ranch passed eventually to their eldest son, young Samuel, who ran it with the same careful devotion his father had taught him, and Theodore and Ruth spent their later years in a smaller house built near the main ranch house, close enough to remain part of the daily life they had built, but with time enough, finally, for the quiet joys of a long life well lived together. And on quiet evenings, when their grandchildren gathered to hear the old stories, it was always the tale of that first spring morning that they asked for most often, the story of how their grandmother Ruth Cooper had ridden onto Wilcox land, seeking nothing more than safety from a cruel man's demands, and had found instead a silent young man kneeling beside an injured calf, a man who would, before that year was through, find in her the courage to reclaim the voice he had lost, and the love that would carry them both, hand in hand, through all the years that followed. Theodore would tell that part of the story himself, his voice still carrying that particular rough warmth even into his later years, and he would always end it the same way, looking across at Ruth with eyes that had never once, in all their years together, lost the wonder of that first meeting. "She rode onto my land," he would say, "and I found my voice. But more than that, my children, she rode into my heart and taught this old, silent rancher's son that love does not need words to be real, only courage enough to reach for it, and the faith to hold on once you have found it." And Ruth, listening, would simply smile and reach for his hand, just as she had that very first evening on the porch so many years before, and hold it tight, grateful beyond measure for the calf caught in the wire, for the wind that had carried her onto Wilcox land, and for the quiet, steady man whose silence had taught her, in the end, everything she needed to know about the true depth of love.